Hello, my lovely listeners. Welcome to Sinister Obsessions with your host, Hannah. How are we all today? We are in our final week of February, entering the month of glorious spring of March, although, as we know, that makes no difference here in Singapore. If you are new here, welcome, welcome. Sinister Obsessions does indeed cover all things sinister. And today we have a brilliant and very high-profile case from Hong Kong back in 2003. Don't forget to follow Sinister Obsessions on Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, and YouTube. Give a little download and rating and like. All the feedback is appreciated. Don't forget to also check out the amazing Korean skincare brand Skinfood, which I mentioned in my previous episode. Skinfood is suitable for all skin types, male and female. I totally recommend the Carrot Carotene Moist Effector, which effectively hydrates and soothes red and irritated skin. The ingredients are obtained from organic Jeju Island carrots. These carrots even undergo a steaming extraction process. The product then uses carrot root extract and seed oil deliver beta-carotene, fatty acids, and other antioxidant ingredients to your skin. The serum provides protection from oxidative damage and also helps to moisturize and soothe the skin evenly. It's non-greasy and lightweight in texture, just a gentle blob at nighttime over your skin. So go on, guys, get that carrot on your face. Korean skincare, do not fuck about. So, anyway, what we're really here for today, milkshake. Who doesn't love a fresh milkshake? Vanilla, strawberry, coconut, banana ice cream. When I think about milkshake, I think of fun, tasty, sweet deliciousness on a warm summer day. Or, if you're feeling a bit more frisky, Kelly's. Either or, I do not think of milkshake as a sauce to use to murder someone. Our story today takes us back to Hong Kong in 2003. It was a typical Sunday morning in the Kissel's household. Nancy and her husband Robert had invited over a man named Andrew Tanner and his 7-year-old daughter for a play date. As the children played, Tanza requested a glass of water, but instead was greeted by one of the Kissel's daughters with a glass of homemade milkshake. The milkshake was given to Tanza, and a glass was also given to Robert Kissel. Tanza went home a short while later, and when he arrived home, his face was flushed and he felt extremely woozy. He went straight to bed, and despite intense efforts by his wife, she was unable to wake him. Although he finally did awake on his own and had a heavy appetite, he then went back to sleep in a somewhat jet-lagged state, and the next morning had very little memory of the evening before. He even described it as some type of amnesia. It was, though, a different story for Robert, who had the other glass of milkshake. Meanwhile, back in the Kissel apartment, Robert too had fallen into a very deep sleep. Only Robert never awoke from this very deep sleep. So what happened in the lead-up to the spiking of 2 milkshakes that led to 2 grown adult men to fall into a deep sleep and one to be brutally bludgeoned to death? Meet the Kissel family, a perfect American family who embarked on living the expat dream in Hong Kong. When Nancy Kissel first met Robert Kissel in 1987, it was a rosy love at first sight. Nancy always knew that one day she would marry Robert. Nancy was born in 1964 in Adrian, Michigan, and spent part of her childhood in Northern California. She studied at the Parsons School of Design in New York City before dropping out after 2 years to take a job managing at the Caliente Cab Company, a Mexican restaurant on Waverly Place in New York. She had also switched to the El Rio Grande on 38th Street, and then she was also a general manager of the Docks restaurant on Broadway in Manhattan. It was whilst she was on a much-needed vacation at the Club Med in the Caribbean where she met her future husband, Robert. Things took off amongst the lovebirds and moved fast. Robert and Nancy had met in 1987 and were married at the East River Yacht Club in New York in 1989. Her close friend Alison Gertz was her maid of honor. Robert Kissel. He was an ambitious young man who had set his goals on being a high-profile stock investor. Nancy, being smart, knew that this would mean a luxury lifestyle for them both. So she supported her husband through and through and wanted him to realize his dream. She put her own career on hold whilst Robert continued his education to obtain a master's degree in finance. Life was picture perfect, truly. The Kissels were in love. They had 3 children together after they got married. And Robert literally started making millions working for some of the top New York investment firms. The financial success landed Robert an opportunity. He was a vice president in Goldman Sachs' Asian Special Situations Group, which led him to Wall Street giant Merrill Lynch and eventually as a manager of global investments in Hong Kong to head its distressed assets business. As the family drank in the thought of an international move, for Nancy, this would be the adventure of a lifetime. And an expat life of a broker in Hong Kong in the 90s was literally the dream. Later, however, Nancy would grow to hate what she considered a filthy city and the isolation created by being an American in a foreign city. As you all know, side note, I'm an expat here in Singapore. I was an expat too in Hong Kong, but I definitely find there to be a huge difference in situations and what you allow your situation to be when you are an expat. Obviously, the reputation that comes with being an expat is most of us are really rich and just want to live our normal lives in a different country, earning a ton more money. Which, yeah, of course, that is the case. However, different expats certainly do have different experiences and different wants. Hong Kong at the time of Nancy being there was still under British ruling. There were plenty of other expats and probably familiarities of Western lifestyle in the city, not to mention being lucky enough to have an incredibly wealthy husband who paid for the beautiful apartment and children's school fees, etc., etc. Honestly, when I first moved to Hong Kong, I was such a mess. I really had no proper plan. I was just on the ride for an adventure. I lived in a studio probably the size of Nancy's bathroom, and you know what? I loved it. I know of many expats in situations like Nancy and Robert, and not often are they opening up properly, really, to experiencing life in these places, like learning Cantonese, diving deeper into the culture, or adventuring outside of the comforts of Central. It does bother me sometimes that many expats don't leave their bubble, and not judging Nancy at all, but I think she definitely went in with the expectations of it being probably very similar to life in New York and living or just bringing her American life over there and expecting things to more or less go her way. But yeah, I would love maybe for some of these types of expats to experience the sort of expat lifestyle myself and some of my friends had when we lived with the good old shoilets. If you know, you know. I honestly don't think you've had a true Hong Kong experience until you have had a shoilet. So yeah. Or go and experience living in one of the matchbox apartments that many locals have to put up with, you know. Hong Kong can be dirty in some places, sure. And I totally agree with her about the bathroom situations. That is just vile. But there's something so special about the city that brings you this type of utopia that no other city in the world can. So Nancy would have had a really good lifestyle in Hong Kong. But as we get deeper into the details, it is more understandable to see how things took such a dark turn for her and why she felt so alone. Nancy was homesick, obviously, and she actually wanted to go back to the US. But Robert disagreed. He was also earning double in Hong Kong compared to New York with a very good expat package. So of course Robert did not want to leave anytime soon. There seemed to be only one way for Nancy to return home with her children and still live the luxury lifestyle to which she had grown very accustomed. That one way in Nancy's mind was murder. Ironically, Nancy ended up spending the rest of her life in Hong Kong, rather than riding out just a few more years before she could have potentially returned. So, life in Hong Kong for the Kissels. What is it like? Well, as you know, I lived in Hong Kong during a very unique time of protests and COVID. But to be honest, when isn't there a unique time to live in Hong Kong? The city is consistently changing at a rapid pace. And Nancy and Robert were unfortunate enough to actually live there during the first outbreak of SARs. It is said that Nancy actually kind of idealized the expat life of a single person who had freedom of adventure and earning their own money. She saw her and Robert as just one of these couples, having an identical life to others in the city, and she didn't like that. She wanted to feel alive, to feel special. Nancy was what most people might call a tai-tai wife, which literally translates to spoilt rich wife. But don't we all want the Tai lifestyle at some point in our lives? The Kissels actually lived in a luxury rise build called the Park View, which is located in Tai Tam. Tai Tam is a beautiful location right by a popular hike called the Twins, and more or less in the middle of Hong Kong Island, where you can see the famous skyline below and then Repulse Bay just on the other side. It literally presents stunning views. Literally. Mountains, beaches, city. Not many cities in the world can grant you this. Today, Parkview is full of serviced apartments, a clubhouse, and luxury facilities. We are talking paying around 40,000 Hong Kong dollars a month to maybe rent an apartment here. That's about £4,000, and that will probably be only a 2-bedroom. Back in the 90s, though, that price would have likely been a lot cheaper and paid for by Robert's company. But damn, it's such a steal in Hong Kong compared to normal city apartments, and rare to find a condo complex like this here compared to Singapore. The Kissels chose this complex because it housed many American communities. Nancy had a helper in the apartment for the children, and she spent her time volunteering at her children's school, which was the Hong Kong International School, and they occasionally all attended a synagogue together. So, according to Nancy, she avoided venturing into what she called the real Hong Kong. She expressed her disgust by the locals' bathroom hygiene and wary of the looks she received whilst walking the streets or riding the bus. She felt lonely and felt as though it was a depressing existence in and of itself. But adding to her roller coaster of moods were now a volatile husband that made life more and more unbearable. Her life in Hong Kong was not as she had expected, and her marriage was crumbling. Things only got a lot worse. Robert had long, demanding hours at work. Thus, he resorted to cocaine to keep himself awake and energetic. Quite quickly, he began adding alcohol to the drugs. Side note, all sounds a little bit familiar to the story I told in episode 3 about Robert Kissel, who was a banker in Hong Kong who ended up murdering 2 Indonesian domestic helpers in 2014. Give that one a listen, it's quite a similar story. This volatile combination became a conduit for physical and mental abuse towards Nancy. If Robert wasn't taking out his physical aggression on her, he was taunting her by telling her that she was fat, that her breasts were sagging, and that she was no longer attractive. Nancy really felt the unbearable pressure to work hard to maintain a picture-perfect appearance. Supposedly, this is what the world of the Tai wives did. They didn't discuss any domestic problems with one another. Instead, they accepted them as part of being a wealthy man's wife. Then, that early winter in Hong Kong of 2003, the city was haunted and plagued, literally, with an unknown virus called SARs. Now that we've all had the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure we are all much more familiar with what SARS is. The 2002 to 2004 outbreak of SARS infected over 8,000 people from 30 countries and territories, and it resulted in at least 774 deaths worldwide. The first outbreak was identified in Foshan, Guangdong, China in November 2002. The World Health Organization was notified of the outbreak in February 2003, and issued a global alert in March 2003. Initially, the cause of the outbreak was unknown, but all sounds very hauntingly familiar, especially with the timeline. But the first outbreak affected people in the food industry, such as farmers, market vendors, and chefs. A fishmonger who fell ill, named Zhou Zhaofen, checked into the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hospital in Guangzhou on the 31st of January, where he infected 30 nurses and doctors. The virus soon spread to nearby hospitals, and an outbreak spread to healthcare workers after people sought medical treatment for the disease. When China notified the World Health Organization, they reported 305 cases, including 105 healthcare workers and 5 deaths. Later, it was reported that the outbreak had peaked in mid-February 2003. However, this appears to have been false because subsequently 806 cases of infection and 34 deaths were reported. And Italian physician Carlo Urbani was the first to identify SARS as probably a new and dangerously contagious viral disease. And ironically, early in the epidemic, the Chinese government actually discouraged its press from reporting on SARS and delayed reporting to WHO, and initially did not provide information to China outside of Guangdong province, where the disease is believed to have originated. Also, a WHO team member that traveled to Beijing was not allowed to visit Guangdong province for several weeks. This resulted in international criticism, which seemed to have led to a change in government policy in the early April of that year. Oh my God, déjà vu much. So on the 21st of February 2003, a mainland Chinese doctor actually checked into a room on the 9th floor of Kowloon's Metropole Hotel. He had already developed symptoms of pneumonia, but did not seek treatment until the next day at a nearby hospital. He sadly passed away 2 weeks later. He had also travelled around Hong Kong before he went to the hospital. He was treated by the triage nurse and doctor without protective measures. After Lu's chest-ray X-ray was taken in Kwong Wai Hospital and it became available, staff became very aware of the situation and started to wear personal protective equipment and full isolation inside the ICU. Lu is believed to have been the SARS superspreader. 23 other Metropole guests developed SARS, including 7 from the 9th floor. Lu's brother-in-law, who sought treatment late February, was hospitalized in Kwong Wai Hospital on the 1st of March, but also died on the 19th of March. It is estimated that around 80% of the Hong Kong cases were due to Lu. Also, actually, in March 2003, SARS got to Singapore on the 1st of March. A 26-year-old called Esther Mok, who was another Metropole guest, was admitted to Tan Tock Seng Hospital after she had visited Hong Kong, starting the outbreak in Singapore. Although she did recover, a lot of her family members did not and actually died. So, really briefly, what was SARS and was it worse than COVID-19? Well, SARS was a severe illness with a high proportion of patients going into respiratory failure. It was deemed worse than COVID as more people died quickly, but that is also the reason why SARS disappeared faster, is because it was killing its hosts rather than being able to spread it. That's just what I heard. And SARS was really weird. It literally just disappeared. Like, it didn't continue. Like, after a few months, that was it. It just stopped spreading. So yeah, patients would worsen quickly, and such events often happened after the period of clinical improvement, weirdly enough. Furthermore, there was no known specific treatment for SARS. And SARS patients feared the worst. They were sick, weak, and breathless, and there was always that fear of the illness worsening, just like COVID. There was also problems with treatment side effects. One patient was suspected to suffer from manic depressive psychosis, when in fact he was manic after receiving steroid injections. Symptoms promptly disappeared, though, when the drugs were stopped. All these torments have endured in isolation because patients were denied the comfort of having visits by their family and friends, who were enormously concerned but could do very little. It kind of just turned into a shit show for a while. And as the infection spread, it imposed a drastic crackdown on all social interaction. The National May Day holiday, when hundreds of millions of people travelled around the country on vacation, was cancelled. The Rolling Stones concert was cancelled. Hong Kongers enacted social isolation even before it was ordered, and many expats departed, including Nancy from our case today. By March, the city felt deserted. Nightclubs were closed, restaurants abandoned, shopping malls desolate. Exactly like COVID-19. This is actually a statement from a man who worked in Hong Kong during the time of SARS. He said, when SARS broke out, we couldn't work from home. The internet wasn't even good enough either back in 2003. Instead, we watched from our offices as the green and white roofed Star Ferry boats travelled, empty across the Victoria Harbour. Each afternoon, we waited for the Hong Kong Department of Health to release its numbers. Literally, this is what I did throughout 2020, 2021, and 2022. We would every day during a wave of infections in Hong Kong check the websites to see how many cases there were and if they're rising or going down and when we would be out of our restrictions. He continued, we learned that officials had actually been hiding cases, moving patients out the back doors of hospitals while World Health Organization inspectors came in the front. We suspected that what we didn't know was worse than what we did. We imagined vast wards of infected gasping for breath. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, on the 1st of April, Leslie Chung, the openly bisexual cantopop crooner and actor who had starred in Happy Together and Farewell My Concubine, leapt from the 24th floor of the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. Chung had always felt like a lucky charm for Hong Kong, a beloved and approachable celebrity. People could even see him drinking in LKF on any given night, but his death was due to his suffering depression. Then, on the 14th of March, an infected man visited his brother's apartment. A week later, the complex had 3 to 4 cases. The next day, 6 or 7 more. Soon, more than 60 new cases a day were emerging at Amoy Gardens, until there were nearly 330, many of them in the Block E, where the brothers' unit was located. It looked exactly like every other housing estate in Hong Kong. As television anchors solemnly intoned over footages of the apartments with their 7-Eleven, McDonald's and parking shops downstairs, one couldn't help but think what was actually happening in there could happen anywhere. Later, it would turn out that the design of the drainage system in the apartments had facilitated the spread of SARS. This is literally what happened in a lot of hotels in Hong Kong. I remember the first few cases that broke out after 8 months of zero COVID in Hong Kong. Omicron came about. It was one of the quarantine hotels. And yeah, it was just really ironic because that's where they were trying to keep people, saying it was safer to quarantine in a hotel. And it spread through all the aircon units and things got out of control very quickly. And at the time, if you didn't know, Hong Kong were also following China's policy of a fucking COVID zero, which obviously just does not work for any virus. Dark times. But anyway, the man eventually said that restaurants reopened. The viral spell broke and Hong Kong seemed to awake from a fever dream. There were magical spring days when the sun flooded Victoria Harbour. The virus had reduced everyone's life to a binary. You either had it or you didn't. Now there seemed to be about 7 million different stories of it. And one day he found himself sitting in a steamy chicken and rice place full of other customers and thought, this is what life is like. And I remember those times where we really thought, will COVID ever be over? I can't believe that was only like 2 years ago. It's mad. But continuing on, had the sick doctor from the mainland been identified at the border and sent to a hospital immediately, Hong Kong and other parts of the world might have been spared the serious outbreak. SARS has underlined the need for better monitoring of the situation and early identification and isolation of potentially infectious subjects to contain future outbreaks of new respiratory infectious diseases. Funny that. At the peak of SARS, with a rapidly evolving scenario, Hong Kong's health authorities had no well-defined response plan. The onslaught of SARS was a tragic lesson that mandated the Health Administration to formulate emergency preparedness plans for the unexpected events of infectious disease epidemics, which could lead to grave and far-reaching consequences. So don't even get me started then on living in Hong Kong during COVID times, where I'm sorry, but the pure arrogance of Hong Kong having zero COVID cases for months at a time meant that nobody got the vaccine. So yeah, I give credit to Hong Kong that in the beginning of COVID, they handled it really well and they were on top of, getting people isolated and wearing masks and putting in restrictions and cutting off the country to the whole world and even the mainland. Only us as residents were allowed to be there. But then they got way too casual about having zero COVID cases that, nobody got the vaccine. When Omicron spread and many, many, many elderly people in Hong Kong had not been vaccinated, the government honestly just didn't really take any responsibility for that. But I got to bite my tongue on this. Bite my tongue. We're not having a COVID rant today. I'll save that for another episode. We're going to get back to this milkshake murder. So the American women and children were leaving Hong Kong in droves. Nancy and her children were among them and headed for the Kissel's vacation home near Stratton Mountain in Vermont. As SARS spread, wives watched the continuous television reports and feared for their husbands' safety. It was a scary time for many, but there seemed to be indicators that the danger would soon pass. Nancy, however, decided to purchase a home theatre system for the Vermont house. And the man who came to install it was a man named Michael Del Pryor. A simple man, but who would bring very complicated changes to Nancy's life. As Michael went about the business of installing the theatre system, he and Nancy talked. As they talked, Michael told Nancy she often wore the same downtrodden look as his mother, who was abused by his alcoholic father. Nancy admitted that she was in the same situation. Bit bold of him, mind. I'm sure Nancy did not need another man telling her that she looked like shit. Anyway, it seemed to bond them more and more. Nancy found more than just a shoulder to cry on in Michael. Soon, the two were knee-deep in a steamy affair, and Nancy lavished her tender lover with expensive gifts. She even got a tattoo at Michael's urging. something Robert had always forbidden. She was thoroughly enjoying this new attention and saw her life for a blissful moment through rose-tinted glasses. But the reality of her life back in Hong Kong came creeping back, because what Nancy did not know was that Robert came to suspect that she was cheating on him while she was back in the US, and he hired a private investigator to confirm his suspicions. It didn't take much for the hired gumshoe to gather evidence of an affair. As we know, in July 2003, the SARS virus seemed more or less contained in Hong Kong, so Nancy and the children didn't have much choice but to return to Hong Kong. However, it didn't mean the end of the juicy affair with Michael, and the two remained in constant contact by telephone and email. Upon returning to Hong Kong, Nancy was beyond anxious, and you couldn't blame her really. She was, and expected, met with a still drinking, still coking Robert, who had become unbearably obsessive. He had been controlling before, a rumoured typical behaviour of a financial guru, but he was even more so now, especially since he knew about the affair. He watched Nancy's every move, constantly asking about who she had spent time with while he was away and where she had been. Additionally, the physical abuse became more frequent and more violent. Nancy had felt such freedom, so much love for Michael during her time in Vermont, and she didn't want to let go of those good feelings. So she obtained a secret cell phone in order to maintain contact. But she didn't know that Robert had hired a private investigator in Hong Kong to install spyware software on the family computer that was also tracking her emails and her internet usage. For Nancy, the noose was tightening. Question was, whose neck was the noose around? Nancy would later claim that she had contemplated suicide as a way out, but she didn't want her children to know it was suicide and grow up with the same feelings of abandonment that she felt after her own mother left her when she was a little girl. So Nancy started visiting several doctors to share her depression and suicidal thoughts, and was able to obtain 5 prescriptions. She actually managed to obtain the date rape drug. Sorry for my pronunciation on this one. There's just no easy way about it. But she also managed to get a painkiller called dextromethorphan. I'm not even going to try and say that again. She also managed to get a sedative and an antidepressant and some sleeping medication. Soon afterwards, Robert contacted the Vermont private investigator and told him that he had actually suspected Nancy of poisoning his nightly scotches. The investigator asked Robert to send him a sample of the drinks, but later testified that Robert never actually did. But by this point, Nancy had had enough. She wanted to go back to Vermont. She wanted to be with Michael. So we are now up to that very Sunday, November the 3rd, 2003, where Andrew Tanzar brought his 7-year-old daughter to the Kissels' apartment for a play date. As discussed in the beginning of the episode, Robert's daughter brought Andrew and her father a homemade milkshake. And after drinking the milkshake, the two men fell into a deep sleep, where Andrew returned home and Robert went to his bedroom. Whilst Robert was asleep, Nancy picked up an 8-pound figurine and used it to batter Robert 5 times in the head. After she had beaten him to death, she decided to roll up his body into a large area rug and hide it for the next 3 days. I do not have information about where the children were during this moment, but I really hope that they were not aware of or witnessed any of this. On the 5th of November 2003, a building maintenance man came to move the rug into storage. Something about the rug did not feel right, so he decided to inspect it, and rolled up in the rug was the bludgeoned body of Robert Kissel. Although Nancy may have been living her American life, she would be facing a Chinese jury. Unlike in the United States, where battering women syndrome is common defense, doing so in the vastly different Hong Kong legal system could have adverse effects. Yet Nancy's attorney opted to go forward with this type of defense and implored the jury to understand Nancy's state of mind, her sense of helplessness, and her fear. Nancy even took to the stand to tell her side of the story, and during her testimony, she told of how Robert, following their visit to the synagogue, told her of his plans to divorce her and keep the children. She claimed Robert then started to walk away, but she chased after him demanding answers. Instead of responding, she said that he had turned and slapped her across the face. Angry Nancy says she pointed her finger in Robert's face, an action of hers he despised, and her testimony continued as she recounted how Robert grabbed her finger and she struggled to break free. She spat in his face, and this enraged Robert, and according to Nancy, he dragged her to the bedroom, threw her on the bed, and began having forceful sex with her. Nancy was able to break free when her struggles caused them to fall on the floor, but as she crawled away, Robert grabbed her leg and began pulling her back. In a panic, she said she grabbed the figurine and twisted around, swinging the decorative weapon as she turned. Nancy thought that this was the end of it. Robert sat on the edge of the bed, stunned, while she continued to hold the statue. But Nancy said Robert gathered himself, grabbed a metal bat, and tried to swing it at Nancy's head. So she used the figurine as a shield. Then, according to Nancy's testimony, everything just went blank. She did not recall hitting Robert 4 more times with the heavy object, or purchasing the rug and rolling him into it. She just didn't even remember anything. She doesn't remember calling maintenance to move the rug to the storage. But homicide detectives were well aware that Nancy had cleaned up her own crime scene, and Nancy testified that she didn't recall doing so, and she didn't even realize her husband was dead until they told her so. But her attorney's strategy failed. After prosecutors described to the jury Nancy's marital duplicity, her internet searches for the perfect combination of drugs, and her obvious efforts to hide the crime, the jurors returned a verdict of guilty. On September 1st, 2005, Nancy entered the Hong Kong correctional system. And in his book, Never Enough, author Joe McGinnis exposed the obvious dysfunction of the Kissel family had been festering for a long time before Robert even met the wife who would eventually kill him. The patriarch of the Kissel's family was overbearing, a crude man named Bill Kissel, Robert's father. Throughout their lives, his 2 sons, Robert and Andrew Kissel, had been pitted against one another. And later, after they had married, the old man was constantly comparing their wives, and Nancy was the one that he hated. After Nancy's conviction, her 3 children were actually sent to live with Nancy's father, Ira A. Kissel, and his wife in Illinois. Finding it difficult, though, to take care of their grandchildren, the couple arranged for Ira's son, Nancy's half-brother Brooks, to take custody of the children and raise them in Cincinnati. A full-time student, Brooks was willing to take on the responsibility with the help of his mother. But the kids' paternal grandfather, Bill Kissel, was not going to allow that to happen. Shelling out an untold amount in attorney fees, the family patriarch had his only remaining son petition the court for custody. Well aware of her brother-in-law's penchant for cocaine and violence, Nancy filed an affidavit from Hong Kong in an effort to keep Andrew Kissel from getting custody of the kids. But it was to no avail that Andrew and his wife Hayley were granted guardianship. But shockingly, in April 2006, under fire from federal authorities for defrauding a New York cop board, Andrew Kissel was actually found murdered outside his Greenwich home. For a while after his death, his wife continued with guardianship of the children, but later turned it over to Robert's sister, Jane Kissel Clayton, with whom the children continued to reside in the state of Washington. Nancy Kissel was granted a retrial that began in January 2011. Perhaps realizing that things were not going well for their client, the defense attempted to stop the proceedings, to allow their client to enter a plea. They were refused, and on March 25, 2011, after 10.5 hours of deliberations, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty again. Nancy Kissel returned to her cell at Thailand Women's Prison, which is near the Chinese border, to serve her mandatory life sentence. Nancy's lawyers did not file another appeal. And in April 2011, they filed a request for their client to be transferred to a U.S. prison under an international inmate exchange program that allows for prisoners to be incarcerated in their native countries. Director of the University of Hong Kong Center for Comparative and Public Law, Simon Young, said that local authorities must state to the U.S. government the minimum time period Kissel is to serve before she can be eligible for parole in order to transfer to be completed. So in 2014, the Court of Final Appeal actually rejected her arguments for an appeal on her second conviction. Nancy also said she still had no regrets about the death of her husband. And at the time, she rarely spoke to her children, who were now in Seattle in Washington. And those poor children, especially the daughter who gave Robert the milkshake, probably lives with a lot of guilt, despite it being completely of no fault to her. That was such a horrific thing for Nancy to do, to make her children get involved and to do that. And of course, devastatingly, they've lost both their parents. They've lost their dad and they've lost their mum. It's really tragic. So that was the story, guys. What do you think? Was this a real cold-blooded murder or a terrified wife who didn't see any other way out? I'm keen to know your thoughts. This was a really big case back in Hong Kong 2003. My parents actually had some friends who were living there during the time and actually recommended this case to me to do. So yeah, it is definitely interesting, especially as I haven't done many stories on like expats murdering in Asia apart from Rorik Jutting. But it happens, you know, it's not all glitz and glam. Anyway, have a good rest of your week, guys. I look forward to seeing you next week with another cheeky episode. Have a good evening. Lots of love to all of you. Bye-bye.